Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox Inside the Racial Pharmacon, a podcast examining anti-racist theories and practices aimed at dismantling destructive identitarian politics and ideologies, both in the US and abroad. Please note that discussions deal with very difficult subject matter, so every episode comes with a general content warning.
And I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, Associate Professor of English, as well as both Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities here at St. Olaf College. This podcast is part of the programming brought to you by the Bolt Chair Endowment, so special thanks to the Bolt family for making this programming possible. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And now, the show.
Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox, coming to you from downtown Minneapolis. We are recording on May 8th, and yes, we are going to come with probably 3 recordings this month, at least uploaded. The last one was recorded in April, but it didn't make the April drop, so we'll be dropping 3 this month, not to compensate, but just because we have awesome guests that have agreed to come onto the podcast and chat with me about specific issues. And today we'll be talking about geopolitical crises, refugee asylum seeking, what constitutes an acceptable refugee asylum seeker versus what constitutes a less than acceptable refugee asylum seeker, what constitutes a geopolitical crisis, and more importantly, what constitutes a geopolitical crisis according to Western European nations and the United States specifically. And in order to help me with that conversation, I have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, a great colleague who I highly admire, Associate Professor of Sociology, Ibtesam Al Atiyat, who was, after being voted to give a talk along with another colleague of ours, Greg Walters, as a part of these lectures that are given at our college called the Melby Lectures, where faculty vote for a couple of faculty that they think are both intelligent and have something to contribute to overall discussions. Ibtesam was voted this year, and after the talks that she gave, once people were mingling in the audience, one colleague who I also admire in terms of her leadership on campus, as we were talking about Ibtesam, without Ibtesam knowing this, confided in me that every time that she talks to Ibtesam, she learns something new. We're talking about a senior tenured faculty member saying that every time I talk to Ibtesam, I always learn something new. She is the smartest person I know, which I think when a faculty gives you unsolicited compliments of that degree, that you're the smartest person that they know, I think says a lot about Ibtesam's credentials and overall existential value as a human being. So thank you, Ibtesam, for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Really happy to be here, Carlos.
I appreciate it. Is there anything I left out of your introduction that you would like to add? Where you come from, how you got to here?
I'm always troubled by questions about who I am. And the trouble is understandable because you also struggle with the same question, because every time you're asked to introduce yourself, you're asked to maybe conduct a confession of some sort. And this confession is not easy. I'm always reminded of that statement in the Bible when Moses asks God, who should I say sent me? And God responds, I am that I am, right? So God gives this non-answer, but it's a very good answer. Yeah. And then people like us, the question of identity is not easy. So I could say about myself that I am of a Jordanian origin. I could also say that I come also from a Palestinian family who was displaced twice, 1948 and 1967. And this is how my Jordanian father and my Palestinian mother got to know each other. And this is how I came into existence. I could do all that. I could claim, with every inch of life within me that I am Palestinian. But then you're confronted with the realization that, well, what does that eventually mean? So the question of identity is not an easy one. So whenever I'm asked that, I give also, like Moses, God, a non-responsive answer, and I say I am a contradiction waiting to be resolved. Fanon has also an interesting response to this. He says, I am one who waits. I study my surroundings, I examine them, and then I give an answer. So that's another answer. So I will wait to introduce myself until I study the context within which you're going to put me, and then I will claim an identity. How is that for an answer?
I think that is great evidence to why people see you as one of the most intelligent people they know, and why I consider you such a great colleague and friend, and why so many students admire you. I've heard that answer before. I am a walking contradiction waiting to be resolved in our conversations. So I'm familiar with it, but I love the fact that your commitment to that political ethic and that philosophical standpoint is unyielding. That's what I really like about you. It's almost like you get in as much trouble around campus as I do sometimes in terms of the things we say inside and outside the classroom. And so that kind of answer, which is one that my identity consists of so much non-identity that it's difficult for me to reconcile that in the typical kind of philosophical sense. And we both know, philosophers that we could reference like Adorno and others, and you mentioned Franz Fanon, who I highly recommend audience, viewers and listeners. If you're listening, by the way, we're going to show a lot of slides today. Just make sure you can find those on the notes and links and on the website, identityparadox.com, because it'd be very unfortunate for you to miss some of the visuals that we'll be sharing and discussing today. So, but yes, that's an excellent introduction, and I agree with you. I am, as many people, all committed 47 listeners and 9 listeners and 47 viewers, that I'm from the border. So yes, when you grow up in the border, and that's been in many ways theorized in terms of borderland subjectivity, the ambiguity with which you grow up, regardless of how strictly and disciplined you are in terms of the identity you are ascribed, it creates a kind of, I would call that just a general existential dissonance. You don't know who you are because you don't know who you are until you're put in a situation to see whether or not you fit. And I think that's some of the stuff that you are alluding to in terms of my framing of you today and your decision of who you are based on that situational positioning, which is extremely strategic and very, very smart. And that's how I think people like you and me and others that come from similar situations of displacement survive, right? It's those that survive are those that know how to fit within a situation, navigate it, and in order to keep moving, not necessarily to settle, but to navigate till you find a place of your own, as Virginia Woolf theorized. So, absolutely. All right. So I wanted to start today, and I just want to be frank and transparent with viewers, listeners, and you, Ibtesam. This is the first talk, I think, chat, whatever you want to call it, discussion, conversation, that I didn't script. Yeah, the email I sent you in terms of like, this is just a general outline, is as much as I scripted this, because I have a lot of confidence in our ability to keep this conversation going, because I think that you and I are not only intellectually invested in these types of issues, because it's what we research and write about, and so that people know, you're a sociologist and I'm an English professor. I'm supposed to be teaching literature and things that have nothing to do with what you do. And yet there is this literary school of thought called the sociology of literature. That is literally an approach that some people take to the study of literature, and one that I have a lot of affinity for. So I think that, and we've already talked about this, we share many students in terms of when we teach in race and ethnic studies and things of this nature. So even though we come from very different disciplines, I have a lot of confidence in our ability to have a conversation around these issues. So let's start with... Yeah, please.
But we're also promiscuous scholars. We do not adhere to the accepted borders of discipline.
I love that. Is that the new promiscuous scholars? I've never heard that. I'm behind the times, I guess, but unless you made that up, and I wouldn't doubt it. I think that yes, Please, I am that. I am for sale to any, not for sale, but I will lend myself to any discipline that I find relevant to what I am studying, researching, critiquing, etc. So yes, the new term, boys and girls, for interdisciplinary scholarship is promiscuous scholars. All right, feel free to start using that. This is what makes Ibtesam hip as a professor, as opposed to me. Like, I wear a tie and I'm a total dork. Ibtesam comes up with cool terminology for interdisciplinary studies as promiscuous studies. Yes, absolutely. So let's be promiscuous with geopolitical crises and what constitutes them. So there's one geopolitical crisis that is at the forefront of American media right now, and that's obviously the current conflict, war, crisis in Ukraine. And one of the things that and it's interesting because it's almost like the potential critique that one might have living in a place like the United States or living in Europe of the conflict and the origins of this conflict and the kind of history behind this conflict didn't gain legitimacy until the Pope came out and criticized NATO. Did you hear about that?
No, I did not.
Yes, the Pope came out and said that NATO is equally, if not more, responsible for the current war in the Ukraine simply because of their expansionism and the way that they've been expanding. So I just want to quickly share a screen that highlights that. So here is an image of the NATO in Europe and the expansion that has been taking place since 1949. And remember, NATO emerged. And please feel free to jump in and correct me or add anything that I'm not addressing that you think is important, Ibtesam. But NATO was created post World War II as a kind of literally what it calls itself, even though it's a North Atlantic treaty organization. The main point of NATO is to establish defense against what was at that point the Soviet Union, to combat the expansion of the Soviet Union with basically a European/Western US alliance in order to keep them in check. And what people don't understand, and what's interesting about this, is that this was literally a treaty, on a contract that was established between NATO and literally Europe and the rest of the world, because the Soviet Union knew this was happening. And this country is infamous for breaking treaties that no longer benefit them. And you can go back to the 19th century and look at treaties around that, and some treaties even up to now in the 20th century regarding the sovereignty of indigenous lands in the United States and the creation of things like pipelines. So 1949, the light blue are the original NATO nations. And if you notice, there's a turn right after 1949, 40 years of expansion with the slightly darker blue. And that would include countries like Germany, for example, which obviously wasn't part of NATO post-World War II because they were, the Nazi nation that was going to have to be denazified. And during that 40-year span, what we get in 1990 is the beginning of neoliberalism as a new political, economic, global paradigm. And so from 1990 to 2000, during that one decade, where we had Bill Clinton primarily as president, we see more further Eastern expansion. And those are the slightly darker countries like Poland, for example, and Romania that you see. And in the last 20 years, since the year 2000, the darker nations Romania would be one of the darker nations, represent that, again, that expansion eastward further and further into what Russia would consider ex-Soviet satellites that are way too close to the country of Russia. So there are bases, European, obviously, and US bases in most of those countries, if not all of them. And geopolitically speaking, this is what people say Russia is responding to. In many ways, it's the eastern expansion of NATO military and economic interests that Russia has constantly been trying to negotiate as not part of the original treaty. Do you have anything to add to that, Ibtesam?
I think one way of looking at the conflict is to look at it through the lens of, the NATO expanding and constituting a threat to Russia. But another way of looking at NATO is to maybe think about it as how empire is manifesting itself nowadays. So if we think of the historical manifestation of an empire, that was, a system based on dynasties and what have you. It covered huge geographies, but it was centered on a dynasty. When it comes to the empire within the context of capitalism, it is those closely knitted nation states, and what binds them together is that adherence, that commitment to the capitalist project throughout the world. So empire against empire, because Russia is also working to realize an imperial dream. So those are two empires in conflict, in contradiction with one another. So we can look at it through the very micro lens that you looked at it, but we can also look at it from a theoretical perspective, one that distances itself from the political science and look at it through the lens of history and social sciences, and just look at how empires manifest themselves in our day and time.
Yes, and that's an excellent point, because at the end of the day, what we see is essentially, and I don't know if you would agree with this, I think this is in many ways a crisis within the neoliberal empire that the Russian empire is also responding to. And what we see here are essentially two imperialistic interests coming head to head in an antagonistic manner over a territory that both consider to be geopolitically crucial to their own individual interest as empires.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to discuss today is the notion of a refugee or asylum seeker, because that is part of the current narrative that's taking place around the war in Ukraine, and how Ukrainian citizens are being displaced, how they're suffering under this Russian invasion, and essentially what the world, and you hear this terminology a lot, the world is rallying around Ukraine. And if you go on the internet, it's very difficult to avoid that, because you see the Ukrainian flag everywhere. People are putting that on their Twitter handles, on Facebook. People are buying T-shirts. I know you'll know nothing about this, Ibtesam, and for the record, I did not watch this, but I watched clips of it. The NFL draft that just happened, I believe this weekend or last weekend, began with an entire ceremony where the whole stage was dressed as the Ukrainian flag. They had a woman come out and begin the proceedings in Ukrainian dress. They were rallying the crowd so it's really interesting. It reminds me a lot of the original Gulf War, the Desert Shield / Desert Storm with a yellow ribbon fever that happened at that time. And that's why I thought that speaking with you about this would be very important, because you and I both represent individuals that live in this country, but have a perspective that's not necessarily total indoctrination within the U.S. We have a perspective that could be called international in some ways, because we've lived in other places or lived in localities that offer a different perspective from mainstream America. So that notion of what constitutes a kind of acceptable refugee or asylum seeker versus the narratives and many of the discourses surrounding the crisis of immigration in this country is worth looking into. And that was very visible publicly, because a lot of reporters that were in Ukraine when the invasion first started were engaging in Freudian slips in terms of talking about the refugees and the people that live in that country. It's like, we're not talking about, basically, they didn't say this out loud, but we're not talking about brown and black people here. We're talking about people with blue eyes and blonde hair who look like us. And here's a white man talking to other white people in the studio. And so the notion is that there was more sympathy and identification with Ukrainian refugees, asylum seekers that were displaced as a consequence of this invasion because of the way they looked and their heritage. And so much of the coverage that's taking place right now in this country, and here's a Wikipedia page that emerged right after the invasion, listing what countries are giving foreign aid to Ukraine based on this current war. And one of the key terms that's used often is the world is in supporting Ukraine. The world is coming to Ukraine's aid. And when you actually look at the map, and I can trust Wikipedia on this, there's a map of countries that are giving defense offensive equipment, that are supplying military assistance to Ukraine. And then there's a differentiation between that and humanitarian aid. So this is literally a map of the countries that are the world, according to the European media and US media. This is the world supporting Ukraine in terms of the war. This is not the world. And I've discussed this with other people, including my students. What you see in gray, the countries, basically the majority of the planet that is not supporting this, and I don't know how they included Greenland, but whatever, is what people refer to as a global south, essentially. And it is important to talk about why leaders from these parts of the country, starting with Mexico, which I've been very surprised, have come out publicly and said, we're not, having suffered US imperialism ourselves, we're not going to come out and support a war that's taking place in Europe that seems to be a problem among European countries that does not involve us. And this is an actual picture, and notice the change of countries that are taking in Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers. Now you see a lot of Latin American countries, even a lot of Asian countries that are willing to take in displaced migrants from Ukraine, but are unwilling to escalate or engage in this war. Anything you want to say about that, Ibtesam?
This is not surprising that Europe and North America sees itself as the world, because they're in real politics term, the movers and the shakers of the world. The rest of the world that you refer to as the global south is either indifferent because it's consumed with poverty, conflict, economic crises, consequences of global warming and what have you. And some do view the situation in the Ukraine as a European interfamilial feud and conflict. What is interesting about the coverage is that it shows again and again this textbook example of Negro power, whose death, whose injury, whose suffering is worthy of attention, is worthy of being, brought into the spotlight, brought into people's daily preoccupations, daily conversations, and who isn't. The global south that you've referred to includes many people who are living in refugee camps, struggling with the consequences of still COVID, not having access to clean water, not having access to vaccinations, not having access to basic needs, not having access to basic safety and security. So it seems that the so-called world has resigned to the idea that Europe is sacred, that suffering, death, war, conflict, hunger, disease is something that is reserved to the rest of the world, to the global south. This is not something that Europeans should experience, especially since the second half of the 20th century. This not only normalizes war and conflict and hunger and suffering in the global south, it dehumanizes as well. It creates this hierarchy between who's human, who's worthy of living in safety and prosperity and free of death and devastation and war and hunger, and who isn't. This is what the coverage is doing. The situation in Palestine, the situation in Yemen, the situation in Afghanistan, the situation in different countries in Africa, different countries in South America, it hasn't changed a bit. There is this constant story of suffering and devastation that nobody pays attention to. And there was that racist moment on BBC that I watched, the one that you referred to about, those are white kids with blue eyes and blonde hair that are being, displaced and terrified. The BBC anchor did not correct the speaker, did not reflect, did not comment, which means that there is an implicit code that this should not be happening in Europe. This should not be happening to Europeans. This is something that the world has reserved to everybody else who's not European. That's the racist dimension of this whole thing.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think just to put it in context, these are first world / developed nations responding to what they consider to be a first world developed nation getting invaded by a non-first world developed nation who has a lot of clout, a lot of influence in the global south, because Russia is known to engage in shall we say, relationships with a lot of nations that the U.S. literally dismisses, marginalizes, or demonizes as being anti-democratic or undemocratic, and engage in a lot of regime change and things of this nature. So I think you bring up some excellent points to some of the case studies that you just brought up, including Yemen, Afghanistan, Palestine, are some of the ones that I do want to investigate, because I think there's a great disparity in terms of how it's covered in the United States and in Europe, and the way that people talk about it, and or more importantly, the silence around those types of ongoing crises that in many ways are equally, if not much more, devastating morally and existentially, as if you are sympathetic to people who are suffering crises and yet are not even mentioned in mainstream American media. But one of the key points, and this is something that I've been struggling with lately, because I feel like when I'm speaking, I feel like I sound like an old Republican, because there are instances where I'm against the current investment of U.S. tax dollars into Ukraine, to the point of giving the people of Ukraine stimulus checks, literally money for them to have in their bank accounts, while some of the issues that you brought up, the lack of addressing basic human needs in other parts of the world, are equally present in this country. There are lots of people that are suffering economic and or as you call it, issues regarding healthcare, which speaks to the necro power, meaning death, that you ascribe, I think, very astutely to the geopolitical situation happening in this country also. We are in many ways engaging in a kind of quiet class warfare with the working class that many politicians see as emerging in terms of power. So I think it's interesting just to share this White House memo that basically talks about the billions of dollars that have been invested already into the Ukraine-Russia war during Biden's presidency, and what this new 800. So they've already added like $2 billion since the start of the war, and they're adding more. And if you notice, most of this are weapons. Well, that benefits the weapons industrial complex. That benefits corporations like Lockheed Martin. That benefits corporations like Raytheon. And there's no secret. I think that today in Meet the Press, the CEO of Lockheed Martin, I think Lockheed Martin is going to be a speaker. So now we have mainstream media promoting the very CEOs that represent the military industrial complex, who are making record profits off of this military aid that's being given to the Ukraine. So it almost seems like we are, at the same time that we're mourning the death and destruction that's taking place, we're also not only allowing that to continue, but we are escalating the level of suffering that's taking place in the same area of the world. Anything to say to that?
As good students of critical race theory, we know that war, incarceration, border control, refugee camps, reservations are profitable experiences for the ruling classes. So there is that connection that is always forgotten between capitalism and racial differentiation, racial segmentation of people. So those particular techniques of segmenting, classifying people into groups, and those practices of incarceration, holding people at the border, but also exercising direct intervention, are not something that is extraterritorial to capitalism. They're inherent within the program of capitalism. So Marx was reductionist when he analyzed capitalism in the sense that he only looked at the economic dimensions of capitalism, that he looked at class in particular in capitalism. It's his concept, his analysis, his framework carries this potential to understanding the many faces of capitalism, many evils of capitalism, and war and incarceration and border control, nation states are all very much connected, tied to the project of capitalism. Capitalism cannot exist without, the world divided into nation states where capital is concentrated at the core and human labor is concentrated in the periphery. Capitalism cannot exist within a country without, that class disparity, but that class disparity that has a racial dimension that continues to generate a group of people that should exist only at the disposal of those who can benefit from their exploitation. So all of these phenomena are very much connected. As you can see, I am not much of an empiricist. I always take the empirical experiences as a moment to theorize, because this is what critical theory is all about. And I hear your students talk about critical theory a lot in my class, and they bring it from your class. So there is a significance to empirical data, empirical anecdotes, empirical examples, but we need to always connect those two for the proper theorizing. So where do we go from there? So one of the things that I always insist on is when we do this exercise of theorizing, we transcend politics, because liberation is not politics. Politics is politics. Politics is acting within the means of the possible. When you think of emancipation, when you think of true liberation, you have to think beyond politics. You cannot think with politics or through politics. You have to transcend politics. You have to go into the realm of the impossible or the unattainable within the current means. And that's the only true theorizing that is essentially critical, and that does not, engage in a ceasefire or a truce with status quo.
Yeah, no, that's excellent points. And just to add to that, basically what you're saying is that the political economy of capitalism is much more multidimensional than just a simple issue of class. And it has many ramifications, which include things like the implementation of racism, the implementation of gender disparities, implementation of all these other things that seem periphery, but at the end of the day are connected to the interest of capitalism, nation states, and the general just political economy of capitalism, whether it's global or whether it's much more local. Is that a fair assessment? Because
it is. And in this sense, one has to also understand that it's not simply nation states that really allow us to understand what's happening in the world. It's those connections that we need to see between the refugee camp, the favela, the asylum seeker, the reservation, the slums, the ghettos. All of these are sites that only have different proper names, but the lived experience, and you have that experience. You have that border experience. The lived experience is identical. The reason why I'm thinking about this, I was recently revisiting the text by Edward Said, Reflections on Exile. And please let me know or alert me if I'm taking too much time.
No. Please.
Because this is eventually your show and you have...
not today.
So in his exile, he passes only superficially on the situation of the refugee, and he recognizes the refugee as a form of exile, and part of that troubled me to the core. And I've decided eventually that Edward Said, in that particular text, knew exile, but he never knew what it means to be a refugee. So I started asking myself, what is a refugee, and how can we define a refugee? And part of the lessons that I've been learning from the entire experiment with decolonization, that we have to go somewhere else and build that definition from, the roots up. And I remember this particular story told by my mother on several occasions, in which she spoke of her father, and her father, they lived in Jenin refugee camp between 1948 until 1967. And my grandfather would get sick, and he would get sick to the extent that an ambulance has to come and take him from the refugee camp to a hospital in Jerusalem. I can't forget how many times my mom repeated this story, insisting all the time that the name of the hospital was never relevant. Where did he go? She said nobody could afford the bus trip from the refugee camp in Jenin to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was so far away, and Jerusalem from Jenin was a 20-minute drive. So nobody could afford this trip. And there were no phones, no means of communication. They just wait for a response, either dead or alive. And she describes that the many times that he came back. At one point, he did not. The many times that he came back, he would come back always with a bag of apples. And what was unique about his apples was that his apples were different in color, and they were different in age. And when she asked her mom why the apples were different in color and different in age, she told her that those were apples given to her father by other people who came to visit. They're sick, but they're sick and had, brought apples and treats with them. And they gave them to my grandfather, and my grandfather saved them for his children, because otherwise in the refugee camp, nobody buys apples, nobody sells apples. So how do you theorize from there? This is not an experience of exile. This is not an experience of an immigrant. There is something in that particular story. There is something in that particular form of existence that is fundamental, that shocks you at the core, that human beings have to exist and under these conditions, even as we live and speak right here, right now. And yet the life goes on, and there's something wrong, something fundamentally troubling about the world, and it cannot be cured with politics. It cannot be cured with politics. I always say that the problem with the Palestinians is not, that of unrealized nationhood. The problem with Palestine is nationalism. It's the very notion of a nation state. Sorry for the long story, but
no.
Tonight.
It's an excellent segue, actually, because I think first of all, I just want to say that I think what you're calling attention to by connecting things like refugee camps to favelas and all this other thing is basically the idea that there's And Jacques Lacan, the famous French psychoanalyst, said this, that the whole world has now become a kind of concentration camp, that you can find sectors of what that means in different parts of the world, but you have literal specific geographic locations that are essentially built upon the model of the camp. And you brought up the favelas in Brazil, and I've been to Rio de Janeiro, so I've seen them personally. I went to a party up in one of them. We have favelas in Mexico too. They're not called that, and people don't talk about it that way, but almost all of Latin America has homes and, impromptu neighborhoods that are constructed on hills by people that cannot afford to buy a home. So they build their own homes and they build their own plumbing systems. And, having grown up half the time in Mexico, I grew up with those kind of favelas. So you're absolutely right in connecting the conditions, to go back to Marx, the material conditions of existence behind what constitutes a refugee versus someone who is in exile. And they can be extremely, very, very different. And one thing that I noticed that you did not bring up is the idea of a camp looking or in any way, shape, or form mimicking something that could be called a castle. So this is how Ukrainian refugees are being treated in France. They get to stay at French castles that are ascribed to specific fairy tales. And there's a whole story here about their location and the stunning buildings and rustic distance and the fact that they're basically tourists come from around the world to be there, but there's nowhere to be seen in this case because essentially the fairy tale castle has reprieved specific refugees from a specific nation that look a specific way into asylum seeking in a place that I would not ascribe or would not depends what's going on behind the walls of the castle, but the fact that it's framed as a fairy tale, I think highlights the fact that different refugees / different asylum seekers are treated differently. And right now, Europe wants nothing to do with African asylum seekers / refugees that in many ways are trying to escape the material conditions of existence that are a consequence of European colonialism in many instances, or neoliberal imperialism. They're trying to escape those material conditions of existence that are dire, and we'll show some examples of what that means in places like Ethiopia, and places like Yemen, and places like Palestine that Ibtesam brought up, or even in places like Mexico. People are not coming to Europe or going to the United States because they are simply looking for some kind of social mobility and to realize an American dream. That's one of the narratives we impose on immigrants, because the United States government does not want to talk about things like how climate change that is a result of American corporations going overseas has created climate disasters in other countries that people now need to flee because they can't literally live in those places anymore. And those are some of the immigrants that you find at the border and that are victims of displacement. They're not coming here out of choice or coming here out of there's no other place to go because where I used to live has become unlivable. So I wanted to show this this brief story that people can look up on the website to contrast what you're talking about in terms of the kind of the necropolitical, necropower around putting people in camps or forcing them to stay in detention centers while they await asylum seeking versus what some European nations, in this case France, are doing in relationship to Ukrainian refugees. And again, I want to highlight that map by Wikipedia. It's not just France. There are a lot of South American countries, a lot of Asian countries that are not aiding Ukraine in terms of military assistance, are still accepting Ukrainian refugees. I read this one story. I forget what nation in Europe is doing it. I think it might be Britain, and I wouldn't doubt it. But they are exporting their Ukrainian refugees to Rwanda, which I think is just cruel. But that is the neoliberal model. We'll take credit for taking all these refugees, and then we'll pay Rwanda to take care of them for us. So it's a very interesting move that some European countries are taking because at the end of the day, they don't want to necessarily have to deal with the actual bodies that any migrant displacement entails. Care to speak to the castle fairy tale story at all?
there was also stories about European governments subsidizing the economies of many other countries of the global south in order to keep Syrian refugees within, the global south, and not just have them come in waves knocking on Europe's door. There's, within the context of all this, there's also this exercise of redefining evil and redefining the ultimate example of evil. Amy Césaire talks about, how the Holocaust was treated as this, unique, exceptional, ultimate example of evil, and there is a lot of danger to cast the Holocaust as this ultimate, unique, exceptional example of evil. Some of the important insights were highlighted by Hannah Arendt in her banality of evil. But what this does, especially in the case of the Ukraine, turning, Russia into this, new global evil, global example of evil and that exceptional form of evil, is that you turn the never again into the permanent Nakba, the permanent catastrophe for everybody else. That only exceptional cases of evil are worthy of attention, of support, of even emotional reaction. So the rest of the world can go to hell. We would never care. So it is the same act to declare wholeheartedly that certain events should never happen again. Yet at the same time, it's a permission to create permanent nakbas throughout the world for everybody else who does not qualify for that particular standard that people would set for absolutely for those standards.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean for the screen to interrupt you, but I was just trying to offer one empirical case study of what you're describing, which is the current ethnic cleansing and humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Ethiopia, specifically in Western Tigray, that the United States mainstream media is not talking about at all as a humanitarian crisis and the need for humanitarian aid, the need to stop this ethnic cleansing that's taking place, and the need to provide some kind of financial assistance and for the world to rally around the displaced migrants coming out of Ethiopia and accept them. That kind of narrative is not taking place. And yet I think there's a reason why we don't want to talk about places like Ethiopia and the fact that there is essentially a real ethnic cleansing, which alludes back to the never again, which alludes back to the Holocaust, which alludes back to the fact that it is still happening in various places around the world, but these places don't count as equally human as other places. Some nations are less human than others in this case. And I think that's one of the points you're making. And if you look in specifically to the Tigray, Ethiopia war that's happening, that ethnic cleansing, we get a lot of coverage right now around what's happening with citizens in Ukraine and hospitals and shelters and things of this nature. Same thing is happening in Ethiopia. And there's no discussion about the food shortage. There's no discussion about hospitals being bombed. There's no discussion about that humanitarian crisis. And I think it's interesting because at the end of the day, if I find this correctly, and I just wanted to show this picture, forgive me for the content warning, but this is the kind of suffering that's taking place right now in Tigray that Western media is not paying attention to. These are the scenes that are coming out of Ethiopia. We get a lot of these kinds of pictures coming out of Ukraine, but we don't hear or see this coming out of Ethiopia. And I think one of the reasons why is because at the end of the day, there are multinational corporates, specifically in this case, everybody's favorite coffee shop, Starbucks, that has specific political and economic interest in maintaining the current powers that be in Ethiopia in power because they profit off of them. Starbucks was one of the main corporations to stop Ethiopian coffee from establishing its own intellectual property. And they established what they called the National Coffee Association that represents coffee roasters of the United States that objected to Ethiopia's application to trademark specific types of coffee. So the reason why I would speculate, I don't know about you, but I assume that you're similar in this regard, is that there's a strong connection, again, going back to capitalism, between the political and the economy / political economy of these nation states or in hemispheric blocks or multinationals that control the narratives around different parts of the world, and why some places constitute a humanitarian crisis that everybody should rally around and people need to contribute money to, versus what countries do not constitute a humanitarian political crisis. And here's another one, right? The United States is still helping fund a war in Yemen, and yet what we don't hear about, and I just want to scroll all the way to the bottom, U.S. involvement, and specifically, well, I'll find it later if I need to come back to it. But the point is that the United States is helping fund this war. The United States has claimed to not be funding this war, and yes, it keeps getting worse. And there is essentially a crisis that, and here's a quote, Yemen is still one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world as a consequence of its conflict, I guess. I don't know what they're calling it because it is a war, and Saudi Arabia is involved in that, supposedly trying to eradicate the remnants of Al-Qaeda and ISIS that might still be in Yemen. And so we're helping fund that war indirectly, and it's created a humanitarian crisis in Yemen where people, children specifically, are starving to death. And again, there's no U.S. coverage about that simply because we are equally complicit in what Saudi Arabia is doing to that country. Perhaps you probably know more about this, Ibtesam, but just want to get some context.
It's not about knowing more about this. What you've covered is actually the facts about the situation in Yemen. But what is interesting about those particular cases, Yemen, Afghanistan, you can also maybe think of the Ukraine in the same sense. This is an exercise of war for the sake of war, because war is very much not the side effect, not extraterritorial to capitalism. It's the very heart of capitalism. This is how capitalism works. But this war for war's sake is profitable. There is a lot of profit to be generated from war. The war in Iraq, the war in Yemen, the war in Afghanistan. Nothing has been achieved in those three particular situations. Nobody is being held accountable for achieving anything of the reasons why the United States went to war in Afghanistan and occupied the country for 20 years and left abruptly, jeopardizing people's livelihood and people's safety, and handing the country back to what was declared to begin with, the enemy. So there is that phenomenon of war for war's sake, because war is profitable. This is how the empire works. It works through war machine, and war will continue to be part of this system until it's abolished.
And I think you bring up a great point. Well, that echoes one of the points you started off our conversation with, which is this concept of liberation, right? We went to Afghanistan, and we didn't invade and occupy, we liberated. And this story highlights the consequences of our liberation. This is the legacy we left behind in Afghanistan. As you said, the Taliban was the number one enemy that justified our quote unquote literal invasion in the first place and occupation. We left. Taliban's now in control. We took the money that we were supposed to leave there for humanitarian aid with us. And at the end of the day, women are being forced into prostitution, and families are being forced to sell their children just to survive at this point. So we're going back to the idea of basic needs. So I just wanted to show this story because it very much speaks to yet another example of what you're talking about regarding humanitarian crisis and what constitutes a human being that is worthy of liberation in the traditional sense of the word and being put into a castle as part of the refugee experience versus people that are literally left behind by imperialism, by empire. Empire goes, it extracts what it needs in terms of natural resources or people, which are a natural resource in that case, and then they leave. And the legacies that they usually leave are not ones of improvement or ones of devastation. So I wanted to contrast the fact that I just want to bring this screen up because this is what I got from the Washington Post. And you can see what I was looking for versus what I got. And I want to share this with the audience because I think it's very telling of the US propaganda machine. I first came across a story of women in Afghanistan having to sell their children and prostituting themselves in the Washington Post. So I went back and I tried to look for it, and you can see that my search is pretty specific. Afghanistan selling children. I tried Afghanistan prostitution and everything, and this is what I got. And I think it's wonderful because it speaks to the fact that if you want to find out about the fact that people in Afghanistan are selling their children to survive, because this is a legacy of U.S. imperialism, what you're going to get is Jill Biden pays a surprise visit. Surprise, her and Justin Trudeau are in Ukraine for a special, they remind me of like celebrities during Vietnam that were surprised at troops by just showing up in order to boost morale. And here's a lovely picture of one blonde woman giving flowers to another blonde woman as a way of welcoming them, or at least offering some moral support, whereas we never see, and we will never see Joe Biden visiting Yemen, doing the same thing, visiting Ethiopia, doing the same thing, going to Palestine, doing the same thing, going to the border, doing the same thing. You'll never see any of that. What you will see is that lovely picture and that surprise visit, which again, I think in many ways speaks to the fact that not all people who are displaced due to war or other kinds of crisis are treated equally by not only the nation state, but what Ibtesam justifiably called empire. So I want to transition to you now, Ibtesam, so you can talk about what we're seeing here, because this just happened, and I am sure that you're more than familiar with all these stories, and you perhaps, and I got a couple of slides with maps that tell the brief history of what happened in Palestine, but I want to start with the contemporary situation that, again, is not being covered by United States mainstream media, because I haven't seen anything dealing with this. What just happened in Palestine with a high court ruling?
Well, there was a recent, but by recent, we need to insist that it's one of many. So it's nothing new. It's a place near Hebron. It's a group of villages inhabited by 1,000 people. And the higher court decided that those exist within an area that is better suited for military training for the Israeli Defense Forces. So they have seized over the villages, demolished the villages, and displaced the 1,000 men, women, elderly, children, inhabitants of those villages. What is interesting about this particular case is that Jewish settlers who also existed around this particular area were not asked to leave, were not, displaced, which there was an interesting article in Haaretz, the prominent Israeli newspaper, that described this rightly as turning occupation into apartheid. This is an exercise of apartheid, a very good example of which, because the demolishing of houses of villages was something that was exercised long before even the establishment of the recent establishment of the State of Israel. My family comes from a village named Zerain. This particular village was captured in late 1947 by Israeli, by Zionist militia. The inhabitants of the village were, displaced, and this is how my family came to live in in a refugee camp. My mom was 4 years at the time. My mom died in Jordan last year. Never set a foot back in Palestine, never visited, could not do even that. The village itself was demolished the same year it was captured, and what remains of that particular place are ruins. Stories that I was told by my grandmother that when they left, they thought that they were leaving for a couple of days, so they gathered everything they had, and they placed all their belongings, which wasn't, anything of what we would consider of value nowadays, and they placed everything in the village's well. And they never came back. It wasn't a couple of days. It was a lifetime sentence to a life as a refugee, a stranger in a foreign country, in a different place, far away from home.
Permanent displacement.
Absolutely.
It's part of like the current U.S. immigration policy, where they just assume if you speak Spanish, you come from a certain country, they drop you off in that country, even if you're not from that country, and you're just expected to somehow survive. So just to add a little bit more to your point, here is a firsthand account from a young man who actually lives in that region, trying to explain to the world, because again, this is not shared on U.S. mainstream media, discussing what is taking place in Palestine at this point.
I watched and filmed with pain the occupation destroying my community. My family and other families here in Masafir Yatta have been lived here for centuries. The declaration of the firing zone is a lie, is a brutal tool to evacuate us from our land. We started the Save Masafir Yatta campaign to save our homes. We're sharing and writing and posting our stories in order to get the international community attention and make them put pressure on the Israeli authorities.
So I wanted to share that because I feel that, one, it humanizes what's happening. It gives a brief background of what's happening. But more importantly, at the end of the day, it provides a certain kind of coverage that is not being provided by mainstream media. We don't hear about this. Anything that you want to add to what we just heard and saw, Ibtesam?
This is what the indifference of, not indifference, there is a lot of difference here. And this difference is bias, and this difference is neglect. This difference is silence. Therein it is a dehumanization. That there is what it says to the world, that there is a segment of humanity fated for this form of existence, that it's not worthy of our passion or our compassion, or even a feel of sorrow, any expenditure of emotion. A segment of humanity is as unworthy of this whole thing. This is again goes to the dehumanization, but the successful effort to other the Palestinians, to erase them from the face of the earth. If there is a genocide, this exercise of genocide has been exercised and practiced systematically since 1947 onwards, and there are many ways that you could erase people from existence. You don't.
Would you consider this one way? What you're seeing on the screen right now?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can you just speak to this, please? Because I don't even feel like I have the standing to speak to such an ugly display of imperialistic, Zionistic takeover of basically evicting people from land that they have inhabited for centuries. The problem is even older than the declaration in 2019. And in 2019, when the Israeli Supreme Court decided that Israel is the nation state for Jews. So it has made a clear decision that this nation state has a particular ethnic, it's the homeland for a particular ethnic group, which means that nobody else can be included in the definition of this nation. Nobody else can be part of this nation state. But this whole thing is problematic because in the United States there's this understanding that the conflict is centuries old. Like Arabs and Jews were fighting, since the beginning of time, which is not true. This is a modern conflict, a modern problem that began with the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement that emerged in Europe had colonial ambitions. This is not me saying that. This was documented by scholars who were Jews themselves. And there is the second misunderstanding that Israel is the only place where Jews can be safe and protected from anti-Semitism. There's a lot of things that can be said about the logic like this, like Europe cannot be reformed, that Jews have to be, taken out of Europe and the rest of the world and concentrated in a place that for the Jews to feel safe, the safety, the livelihood, the existence of another nation has to be, put in jeopardy. And this is what is happening. There are many people who are still optimistic out there and still speak of the two-state solution, and others would speak of one-state solution. Edward Said was the Palestinian scholar, was at one point hopeful that a one binational state could be a possibility to resolve this particular conflict. The prospects for a two-nation state, as you can see, is, and you will show from your other maps, are not viable anymore. Although this is a painful realization to come to terms with, but it is perhaps a moment to really rethink. The Palestinian occupies this peculiar position in the world today to show us what liberation looks like and what liberation beyond nationalism looks like. The Jew at one point, after the Holocaust in particular, occupied that position just to teach the world what humanity looks like. And if Israel is the lesson learned from the Holocaust, then we're in deep trouble. For the Palestinians, if the emancipation of the Palestinian is yet another nation state where we can just lay borders and do border control and declare other people trespassers, then we remain in that deep trouble.
we're in a significant historical moment, and if there is hope, that hope lies within, the Palestinian occupying that particular position, showing us the way to true emancipation, to true freedom. And the Palestinian is not, alone in that. It's the Palestinian, it's the Black, it's the indigenous, the Aboriginal, the inhabitants and the residents of the favela, of the asylum, of the slums, of the ghettos, of all the places which are declared, places where wasted humanity is fated to reside.
So in many ways, I think what you're describing is, as we see this map of exactly what you've been explaining to us, is that there's been an increasing nationalization of these territories where these people used to just coexist naturally outside of that kind of politicization. That now, once it became politicized, it led to essentially this kind of what I would call a segregationist state that essentially is built upon a settler colonial model that is now engaging in imperialism by expanding that settler colonial model through evictions and through these bogus rulings that date back to 1980, when in reality, this conflict dates back to the 60s, and the people that inhabited these families that are being evicted have lived there long before Israel even existed as a nation. So it's bogus international law in the first place. But on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right that, and many people want to make this argument that you cannot critique Israel because if you do, then you're an anti-Semite. And I think it was a Harvard Crimson, I forget what their student newspaper is called, but they've come under a lot of attack because they came out with an op-ed saying that to boycott, disinvest, and basically to engage in this kind of critique of Israel around, is it BDS, the initials?
Yeah.
That is not anti-Semitic, that to criticize Israel as a nation state is not to engage in anti-Semitism, and that narrative, that form of excusing what's happening right now in places like Palestine is part of the ideological apparatus that the nation itself uses as a way of silencing critics on the, as you very succinctly put it, the dehumanization of the other, which in this case is the Palestinian. So suddenly it's an ironic reversal of what the Jew represented post-1940s as the embodiment of like, never again will we dehumanize people. Suddenly you just start substituting other people. And in this case, it's people who identify as Jewish, othering and dehumanizing people that literally welcomed them into those territories in the first place.
Right. And boycotting is not new in history. Martin Luther King promoted boycotting. The irony, he used the example of Coca-Cola and Wonder Bread. And the example of South Africa. But there is also a legitimate criticism out there of the BDS movement. What this boycotting does is that it offers a market solution, and it still falls short of true liberation. It is a market solution for a non-market problem. So capitalism, again, is offering itself as a cure for what it has always been, the medium of. So this is, turning the evictions, turning, the life in exile, turning the life in a refugee camp, turning death, turning disability, turning the horror of, being divided by a wall, turning the checkpoints, turning all that into a financial transaction. And that financial transaction is not thinking in the right direction. Although I acknowledge the effectiveness of this method in the cases cited earlier.
It'd be great if it was boycott capitalism, not just boycott a specific nation and its products, right? And its services, like,
Absolutely.
Spyware. Who's not going to buy spyware from Israel right now? They have the best spyware in the world. So I just want to bring up this slide again, just to confirm one of your points, which I think is excellent and speaks to the fact that when you look at the case studies or empirical situations. You want to theorize, you want to use that material situation and the reality of it and extract some kind of theory as a way of not only thinking about that situation, but trying to think beyond it or outside of the current framing under which it's placed. So if I understood you correctly, what we see in this map is basically things that we already agreed upon, settler colonial imperialist model that involves nation state solutions, and it continues a kind of nation state problem. And what you're promoting is that the solution to the problem that this map represents should not be resolved in terms of the current status quo rhetoric and ideological options available around the concept of a nation state. If you feel if there's a resolution to what's happening right now in Palestine and Israel and that conflict, we should imagine something beyond the nation state. We should imagine something beyond the current status quo, because if we insert any version of the status quo into that situation, it will only reproduce the same problems we're witnessing right now, just in the future, and it may look differently, but in its essence, it will be a version of the same thing.
Right. And this brings us back to the point that we've discussed earlier, that the refugee camp, that the Palestinian, that the Black person, the ghettos, the favelas, the slums throughout the world are sites that are comparable. They're only different in terms of their proper names. And if Marx once invited the workers of the world to unite, and his call has failed because capitalism prevailed and communism never did. Perhaps it was because his call was not comprehensive enough, was not thorough enough, that he did not really understand the world beyond his experience, his immediate experience, and Norway experience in Europe. So it is only when we understand that you and I are different, but only in proper names, but in real terms, you and I are not that different. That the larger structures that produce my existence are not that different from the larger structures that produce yours.
And just to speak to that, just to begin to wrap this up and to speak to your point, something a little bit more local is happening right now at the U.S.-Mexico border. And just one thing that I want to begin talking about is you highlighted the fact, the wall, families being separated, everything that was discussed under Trump. I want to just inform the audience, for those people that don't know, that many of the same policies that Trump implemented along U.S.-Mexican border immigration stuff is still happening under Biden. So it doesn't matter now that Democrats are in power, they're going to treat asylum seekers and immigrants and refugees better. You already saw plenty of cases where the Biden administration is escalating situations that are humanitarian crises, if not disasters, in places like Yemen and Ethiopia, and I would argue at the U.S.-Mexico border. And again, it's not getting the same kind of outrage from people that ascribe or identify as liberals, simply because it's not being covered the way the current Ukraine-Russia war conflict, whatever, is being covered. So I just want to let people know that Mexicans have been invited to come into this country as laborers for decades, for close to a century at this point. And it started with the Bracero program, which was basically a way of bringing cheap labor in order to help the agribusiness in the United States during World War II. And essentially it became an agreement in 1951 that ended in 1964. And yet there's a study that the Bracero program did not have and many of the people argued that the reason why it needed to get eradicated, the reason why we needed to get rid of it is because it was taking jobs away from Americans. And a recent study shows that it never did and it never has. This lie that Mexican immigrants take over American jobs has been continually disproven as false. So I want to highlight the fact that continues to be the case right now. Mexican laborers are essentially undocumented laborers, undocumented immigrants constitute basically half of the workforce that works around agriculture, which is where your food comes from, which is where a lot of your fresh produce comes from. To go back to your grandfather's story, that's where the apples comes from. Someone has to pick these things. In the United States, it is Mexican workers, and yet this is how we treat them, right? This is the same. And I wanted to highlight the fact that this is a recent, as you can tell from the banner, this is a very recent study, less than a month old, and it's basically saying that there is still inhumane and wasteful treatment of people at the border. And most of these people are going to be from Central, South America, or Mexico. But when it has to do with the Ukraine crisis, there's a very interesting word that is inserted into the report, or in this case, the story. There's a new type of migrant at the US-Mexico border now. And this is important because these new migrants at the Mexico border don't look like the old migrants at the Mexican border. They look more like us. And therefore, they're going to get a specific kind of treatment in the United States, as opposed to your typical brown. And this was happening in terms of also people being allowed to leave Ukraine during the invasion. They separated people that looked a certain way from people that had brown and black bodies, and they were put in lines and never made it to the bus, or never got on the train to escape their situation. Again, just to highlight the fact that Mexican undocumented labor has been encouraged in this country for almost a century now. We're introducing the new type of technology that speaks to Ibtesam's point about what is necropower or necropolitics, a politics of death. Migrants are dying at record numbers because they're being basically kettled into crossing into the United States. And I personally have visited these places, some of the most dangerous places in the desert, if not, you could argue the world, to survive in. They're being basically channeled into those locations if they're going to cross. And those places are weaponized in terms of climate. People die of heat exhaustion often in those places. And the Border Patrol don't respond to 911 calls for migrants because it's a lot more cost effective, and you have less paperwork when you go and report a corpse as opposed to a rescue. So they tend to shy away from rescues. But they have robot dogs now that are going to police those inhumane parts, those very dangerous parts of the desert, in order not to have the actual Border Patrol agents risk their lives by going on these ATVs and basically patrolling parts of the country that nobody visits outside of migrants crossing to the desert or people that are looking for extreme experiences. So again, just to speak to your point, Ibtesam, it's happening at the US-Mexico border. People don't want to talk about it. We have robot dogs now. This is very dystopian at this point. It's almost like Children of Men, the film. We have borders, we have camps, and now we've incorporated this technology that is robotic as a way of policing, disciplining, and surveilling those bodies that we don't want to come into this country, or that we haven't yet vetted as acceptable in terms of their refugee asylum status. If you want to say to that.
And that's why it's troublesome, this quality of mind that draws a distinction between a wall and a border. There was this alarm and protest when Donald Trump was calling, I'm going to build a wall between the US and Mexico, and I'm going to have Mexico pay for it. All that nonsense. And our colleagues on campus were outraged by the statement. And it hit me, like, really, do you really recognize a difference between the wall and a border? Wouldn't you just see the border doing exactly what the wall does? Is just the wall hits you with its symbolism. But what the wall would do is to make your border more efficient. So you want to maintain the border and abolish the wall. What an idea.
No, that's a great, this is why I enjoy talking to you, because I think I never even thought of it that way, but I think that's a great point. The way that I try to teach my students that essential thesis, that point you just made, is by showing pictures of people standing at the four corners in the United States where you can literally put your hands in, like, I think Colorado and in Utah, and your legs. And so one person is essentially, their body is inhabiting 4 states at the same time, which highlights the silliness of borders as a concept. But if you put a wall that separates states from each other, then it makes that a lot less fun, because then you can't go do that in places like that, because then the wall reminds you that these are borders. Yeah, as artificial as they are, they're just lines on the ground in this case, in order for you to have fun with it. At the end of the day, they're meant to function as spaces that differentiate one location from another location, and everything that means. In some cases, the right to have or not have an abortion, for example, or whether you will be criminalized for being undocumented versus being left alone for being undocumented. So just to wrap up, I think, Ibtesam, please correct me if I'm wrong, one of the general points that we're trying to make here is that the geopolitical situation happening in places like Ukraine is not very different from the geopolitical crisis, a humanitarian crisis taking place in nations or locations like Yemen or Ethiopia or Central America or Mexico or et cetera, that there's Palestine. There's a lot of places around the world that are experiencing similar, if not worse, types of humanitarian crisis. And yet, because of first world developed nation and capitalist political economic interests and the histories and the various kind of, if you will, branches that capitalism has in terms of the things that it can impact, what is traditionally called the superstructure aspect of capitalism as opposed to the economic base, that is what we're witnessing right now in terms of the coverage of what constitutes a refugee that is deserving of sympathy and is deserving of some kind of aid and some kind of identification with, as opposed to those that are dehumanized in order to not be covered by media, in order to not get that kind of attention, and in many ways the humanitarian assistance that they need because of their dehumanization.
Absolutely, absolutely. And those are important ways of thinking in parallels, thinking about different events taking place in different places, recognizing their rightful difference, but thinking of how they relate to one another. And we've talked about, racial capitalism, and we've talked about, the new face of the empire at the beginning of this session. So all of that can help us, theorize at that level.
Well, I think you're like me in the sense that you don't like to promote yourself often, in terms of like, so Ibtesam, where can people find you? It's like, I don't want people to find me. Where can people email you? I don't want people to email me. But anything that you would, any final words or anything that you're working on that you would just want to say, hey, I got a project or a book that I'm finishing, or an article, or anything that you just want to tell people that will eventually listen and view this?
It's not that this is a project that I'm working on. One of the things that I do every semester is I begin with generating a new set of questions, and those questions will, constitute not only the center of my scholarship, but the center of also all of my lectures and conversations with the students. So this is what I've been up to this semester, is realizing that there is a lot of scholarly inattention to the refugee. And there is a lot of work on the exile, because it's attractive for people like yourself in the humanities. But that refugee is somebody and the way of existence that was never sufficiently theorized, perhaps for the reasons that Gayatri Spivak talks about. Can the subaltern speak? Can the refugee speak? Can she theorize? Because obviously the exiled can speak for himself. Edward Said does, but my mother cannot, my grandmother cannot in that sense. So those are the questions that I'm being troubled by this particular semester, and they may constitute something that I will be working on in the summer. Another perhaps some minor project, minor might be an understatement, is this experience, teaching at a liberal arts college for the past 10 years of my life, it's a rich experience that has taught me a lot and has generated a lot of questions in my mind. I'm sure you're going through the same exercise every day. But maybe something about surviving the liberal arts and how that feels like. And that's a project that is long term, and it's not necessarily for the summer.
That is extremely thought-provoking. It's got me thinking suddenly in a variety, surviving the liberal arts and what that entails. I think it's a very interesting concept. Both of them. I think you can establish a curriculum on the first thing you're studying and working on over the summer. And on the second one, I think that you could probably recruit a lot of faculty that have their own stories regarding what it means to survive the liberal arts college, especially when your liberal arts college identifies as specifically tied to a religious identity. I think it makes the navigation process very unique and harkens back to a lot of older empire models and what justified them in the first place. So best of luck with those projects, Ibtesam. I think this is what makes you an awesome scholar, an awesome teacher, and a great human being, is that you're always committing your time and efforts towards investigating the problems that impact all of us and not just things that you find intellectually stimulating. So again, thank you for that. Thank you for being an excellent faculty member and an excellent colleague and a great friend. I really appreciate you coming onto the show and giving us your valuable time and insights into a very complex geopolitical moment, I think, in terms of world history and whatever is left of it. So thank you, Ibtesam, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure talking to you, Carlos.
Same here.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. And that will do it for today's episode of the Identity Paradox. Again, please make sure to check out the website, identityparadox.com, in order to get access to links and show notes specifically for today's. All the links to the slides and the news stories that we discussed will be made available there. So again, thank you. Again, stay frosty, watch your shit. Reboot. Stay frosty, watch your six. Y hasta luego.
Oh, and don't forget to please subscribe to future episodes if you enjoyed today's. Thanks.